Do you want to know an easy way to make your subject pop out of the background and feel like it's sitting right in front of you? If you've ever finished a drawing and thought that it didn't quite look three-dimensional enough, this is going to help you with that. I'm going to walk you through how I created this bunny step by step and show you how using a soft, blurry background makes your main subject stand out in a really natural way. I started this piece with pan pastels to get those first layers down, and then I switched to pastel pencils for the details. And I started with a burnt sienna colour, and I added that wherever I saw that kind of colour in the reference photo. And this is the easiest way for me to get started, which is basically choosing a colour from the reference photo that looks really obvious to me, and then I can add that colour into the spot where I first saw it. And then while I'm using that colour, I can add that anywhere else that I can see that same colour in the reference photo. And then I'm going to move on to the next most obvious colour to me, and basically repeat that process until the base layer is blocked in. If you want to create depth in a drawing like this, don't focus too much on adding a lot of tiny details or trying to pick the right colours. Think about how your eyes focus in real life. The subject you're looking at is clear and in focus, and then everything else behind it kind of fades away. You can also apply this concept to your artwork so that your viewers instantly know where to look because your background fades away. That's what we're recreating with pastels in this piece. If you don't have the exact brands or colours that I have, don't stress too much. You don't need every pastel colour under the sun. What matters is how you use what you already have. If you do decide you want to invest in some more pastel supplies, make sure that you choose the right paper first. I always use Clairefontaine Pastel Mat for my pastel pieces because it lets you add a lot of layers, allows for finer details on top, and doesn't give you a grainy looking end result. Most other papers labelled as pastel paper won't give you the same results as this paper does. You can save money on your pastel pencils or pan pastels by starting out with smaller sets, but don't compromise on the surface because you will basically struggle with it the whole time. Make sure that your pastel strokes follow the direction of the fur, even in this base layer, because the direction of your strokes is going to show through in the end result, and it will add to that fur texture. When you're using these soft tools with your pan pastels, make sure that you're not pressing too hard with the sponge because the paper has a bit of a texture to it, which is going to wear away your tools really quickly. Instead of pushing harder to get more pastel to come off of your tool, just go back into your pan and pick up more pastel. Your sponge tools will last a lot longer if you take care of them. At this point in the process, you're not trying to add tiny little details, you're just blocking in those main shapes of colour. This layer is supposed to look quite patchy with quite a lot of that paper colour showing through because it's going to allow you to add more layers of details with pastel pencils on top. Once I finished blocking in that base layer of the bunny, I moved into the background. Unlike the bunny, I am adding more pastel into the background because I want it to be soft and blurry, and I know that I don't need to add pastel pencil details on top, so I can add a lot more of the pan pastel to get that kind of effect. I wanted variation in the colours without any sort of sharp edges in the background, so I used bigger soft tools and layered colours like reds and browns near the bottom, and then softer pinks and beiges towards the top, and little bits of violet and blue scattered throughout to make it look a little bit more interesting. And again, in the first layer of the background, your pastel strokes might look a little bit messy and patchy, and that's completely normal. We can keep layering on top until we get everything smoothed out. The more pastel you build up in the background, the softer and blurrier it gets. And that's how you get that out of focus effect that pushes your subject forward. I also blend my first layers with a cotton tip, following the fur direction if needed. Blending this way helps push the pigment down into the grooves of the paper so that I can add more details on top. It also helps get rid of some of that excess dust and helps smooth out that grainy look that you can get with pastel pencils. I started the next layer with pastel pencils so that I could start adding textures and details over the base layer. I'm concentrating on adding more details around the face and less details as the bunny blurs into the background. When you're working on white fur, remember that it will reflect colours surrounding it. So I like to add in colours like blues and purples, especially in the shadow areas, just to make it look a little bit more interesting. I try to avoid just using greys and blacks in the shadows because it can make it look quite flat. When you're creating fur texture, keep your pencil strokes varied. Make some of the strokes shorter, some longer, and some curving in slightly different directions, because if every stroke is the same, it's going to look unnatural and kind of wiry. On the areas of the fur that are more out of focus, like the back of the bunny, I softened everything with circular strokes since that area is out of focus and you can't really see the fur details. One of the most common questions I get asked is, how do I choose the right colours? And honestly, there's no right colour for any specific subject. I use this example all the time, but I could paint an elephant purple, and as long as the proportions and values or your light and dark areas are correct, then it's going to look like a realistic elephant, just in some weird lighting. Your colour choices are really not that important. If your dark areas aren't dark enough or your highlights aren't bright enough, the drawing's not going to look as realistic. You could choose a lot of different kinds of brown for this rabbit fur, for example, and as long as it's a similar value to that colour in the reference photo, so not too dark or too light in comparison, then it's going to look realistic. If you're not sure whether your values are correct, you can take a photo of your artwork on your phone and then switch it into black and white, and then compare it next to a black and white version of your reference photo. That way you'll be able to see if your shadows and highlights are strong enough in comparison to those same areas on your reference photo, because you've taken that colour out of it, so it's a lot easier to see what areas are light and what areas are dark. For the really bright highlights, I'm using a Caran d'Ache white pastel pencil because it's a softer pastel which allows you to layer on top of some of the harder brands, especially when you're struggling to get those final details on top. I use it sparingly on the whiskers, the shine in the eye, and the brightest fur to really make those areas pop. Remember to keep the details sharp where you want the viewer to look, keep the rest of the piece soft and out of focus, and make sure your values are correct. If you do those three things, then your subject will stand out and look three-dimensional every time.